On Christmas Day, I held a pregnancy report in my hand, full of excitement, as I hurried to share the good news with my boyfriend Stephen Jones. But what I didn't expect was to overhear his conversation with two of his friends. "Stephen, you're not seriously planning to marry Cherry, are you? The eldest daughter of the Cooper family has her eyes on you. If you marry Giselle, you'll have everything." "Exactly, Stephen. This is your one and only chance." I stared at Stephen nervously, waiting for his response. After some time he spoke. "I will break up with Cherry." At that moment my heart shattered into pieces. I couldn't remember how I made it back home. Sitting alone in my apartment, Stephen's words kept replaying in my mind like a broken record. Stephen and I were college classmates. In my first year at university, I developed feelings for him. Knowing his family was struggling financially, I pretended to be a poor student too, just to ease his insecurity. During our college years, though life was tough, we were genuinely happy. At that time, I truly believed I had found the person I'd spend the rest of my life with. Even after graduation, when my father urged me to return to the family business, I resolutely refused. I wanted to stay with Stephen and build a future together, but in the end, he betrayed me. It was only then that I realized how foolish I had been. I fell asleep on the couch, and when I woke up, Stephen had returned. The strong smell of alcohol and faint perfume lingered on him. I didn't have to ask to know he had been with Giselle. His eyes were conflicted as he looked at me, but all he said was, "I'm tired," before heading straight to the bedroom to rest. I sat in the living room in silence, watching his retreating figure. Then, I made an appointment for an abortion the following day, and called my father. "Dad, I'm coming home," I said. My father was overjoyed. After all, he had been hoping for this moment for a long time. "Will you be bringing your boyfriend home with you this time?" he asked with a laugh. Hearing his question, I broke down in tears. I had sacrificed everything for Stephen, but the only thing that I got was his betrayal. My father was alarmed by my sobs, repeatedly asking what had happened and offering to come to me immediately. But I refused. I assured him I would handle everything before returning home. After hanging up, I packed my belongings and left a note for Stephen. The next day, I went through with the procedure. The sympathetic gazes from the nurses cut through me like knives, but I forced myself to stay composed. As I lay on the hospital bed afterward, my phone rang. It was Stephen. "Cherry, where did you go?" His voice was laced with anger. "What does your note mean? Are you breaking up with me?" I let out a soft laugh. "Stephen, isn't this what you wanted? You chose Giselle long ago, didn't you?" My words silenced him on the other end of the line. After a moment, he lowered his voice and asked, "How do you know about Giselle?" Hearing I didn't answer, Stephen anxiously said, "Cherry, it's not what you think." I chuckled coldly, then ended the call. I no longer had the energy to entangle myself with Stephen. I called my father again to confirm my return. This time he came to pick me up personally. When he saw me, his eyes were filled with pain and concern. I could see the pain in my father's eyes as he brought me back home and urged me to rest. During this time he took great care of me, and little by little, I began to move on from Stephen. But one day, while scrolling through my social media feed, I stumbled upon a post that stopped me in my tracks. It was a picture of Stephen and Giselle at their engagement party. In the photo, Giselle was heavily pregnant, holding onto Stephen's arm with a triumphant smile. I stared at her round belly and chuckled bitterly. So this was the truth. Stephen and Giselle had been together all along. She was already carrying his child. To keep me distracted, my father suggested I start working at the company, since I was new my workload was light. One day, my secretary informed me about an upcoming business gala that I needed to attend. I agreed without giving it much thought, never imagining that I would run into Stephen there. He arrived at the event with Giselle on his arm. When his eyes met mine, his expression turned complicated, while Giselle looked at me with unmistakable arrogance. "You must be Cherry Adams," she said, her tone condescending. I nodded. "Yes, that's me. I didn't expect your company to send you for this collaboration," Giselle sneered. "You know, I'm quite close with your company's CEO. In fact, the eldest daughter of your family is one of my best friends." I blinked at her, then smiled politely. Her claim was laughable. This was the first time I'd met her, so how could she claim that we were best friends? Besides, our family status was leagues above hers. The Cooper family had begged for this collaboration, and even then, I wasn't sure if it would go through. As the wealthiest family in the province, we held all the cards. Giselle's display of superiority was clearly aimed at humiliating me, but I chose not to react. Behind me, my assistant seemed ready to speak up, but I motioned for her to stay quiet. Stephen walked over, his expression conflicted. "Cherry, why did you leave without a word?" I smiled faintly. "I was just making space for you and Giselle." My response made his face darken further. "Cherry, you know I came from the countryside," he said after a pause. "If I want a better life, I have to hold on to someone like Giselle." I nodded. "You're right. Your choice makes perfect sense." My calm acknowledgement seemed to unsettle him even more. "Cherry, after you left, I went looking for you," he said bitterly. "I know you went to the hospital." "Stephen, I'm grateful." I interrupted him coldly. "I realized back then that you weren't the right person for me. Walking away was the best decision I could have made. Otherwise, I'd probably end up being used by you until there was nothing left of me." My words struck a nerve, and his expression turned even uglier. I handed the rest of the evening's matters to my secretary and left the venue without another word. Just being around the two of them soured my mood. It was better to avoid unnecessary contact. After I left, my secretary reported that Giselle continued her high-handed behavior, even going as far as publicly claiming to be my best friend. I laughed at the absurdity and instructed my secretary to tolerate her for now. As for the collaboration, as long as I'm here it won't happen, I said decisively. That evening, Stephen called me. "Cherry, let's meet," he said. I rejected him without hesitation. "Stephen, there's nothing left for us to discuss." "Stephen, there's nothing left for us to discuss." I spoke coldly, my voice devoid of emotion, but on the other end of the line, Stephen responded quickly. Cherry, you wouldn't want the collaboration between our families to fall through, would you? I laughed at his words. Did he not realize that whether or not our companies collaborated was entirely up to me? Stephen had no leverage in this matter. What I didn't expect was that after I rejected him, he barged into my office the very next day. Mr. Jones, I said coolly, isn't it rather impolite of you to storm into my office uninvited? I gestured for my secretary to leave, leaving only the two of us in the room. Stephen's eyes reddened slightly as he looked at me. Cherry, when you left, I went looking for you. Did you abort our child? His voice trembled with anger. I stared at the fury in his eyes and laughed, incredulous. So this is why you're here? I said icily. You want an answer? Fine. I didn't want my child to grow up without a father. Does that satisfy you? My words seemed to drain the color from his face. Cherry, you and I both came from nothing. You know how hard it is for people like us to climb up the ladder, he said. I agreed to marry Giselle, but I never intended to give you up. His declaration was laughable. And what's your point? I asked, my voice cold and unyielding. Cherry, I still love you. I don't love Giselle, he said. If you come back, we can still have a future together, even have our child. My marriage to Giselle is just a stepping stone for us. Hearing his shameless justification, I couldn't help but laugh out loud. Leave, Stephen, I said, pointing to the door. At that moment, whatever lingering fantasies or warmth I had for him shattered completely. I had been blind to see his true nature. He looked at me with desperation. Cherry, do you even know how close Giselle is to your company's boss? All it would take is one word from her, and you'd lose your job. Cherry, you'd better listen to me. If she ruins your career, you'll still have me to rely on. His words were so absurd that they were almost comical. No need, Stephen, I said firmly. Rest assured, no matter what happens, I'll never come to you for help. Before I could escort him out, the door to my office slammed open again. This time it was Giselle. She stormed in, her eyes blazing with fury. I knew it. You're the vixen trying to seduce my husband. I looked at her coldly and said, I have no interest in your husband. Both of you, please leave. Leave, she screeched. We came here for a business collaboration, not so you could seduce my man. She continued shouting, where's your boss? I demand to see him right now. I'll make sure you're fired. Her tantrum was pathetic, and I watched her with icy disdain. Stephen rushed to her side, trying to calm her down. Giselle, let's leave. There's nothing between me and Cherry. Stephen reached out, trying to pull Giselle away, but before he could, she slapped him hard across the face. Stephen, I married you because I pitied you, and now you dare to cheat on me, she yelled, hitting him repeatedly while berating him. Stephen lowered his head, retreating step by step under her assault. Watching this unfold, I shook my head. The Stephen I once knew was confident and ambitious. Now he was reduced to this pitiful state. I observed their scene coldly and gave my secretary a subtle signal to call security. She quietly stepped aside with a phone in hand. As Giselle landed slap after slap, Stephen stood there humiliated. A sense of ironic satisfaction washed over me. Thank goodness I hadn't married him. At that moment, I felt nothing but relief for seeing his true colors before it was too late. Suddenly, Giselle turned her anger toward me, glaring as she screamed, It's all your fault, you vixen. You seduced my husband. She lunged at me, ready to attack. I wasn't Stephen. The moment she came close, I slapped her hard across the face. The slap echoed in the room. Both Giselle and Stephen froze in shock. Recovering first, Stephen grabbed my arm, his voice rising in anger. Cherry, what are you doing? Do you realize you just hit Giselle? You could lose your job for this. He glared at me, demanding, apologize to her now. I smiled faintly, pulling my arm free. She came at me first, I said calmly. Giselle Livett screamed, I want to see your CEO. I'll make sure you're fired. She stared at me fiercely and shouted, You're dead, vixen. Her rage amused me, but I shook my head. My patience with these two was running out. Cherry, stop this nonsense. Stephen scolded. You don't know, do you? Giselle's best friend is the daughter of your company's boss. One word from her, and you're out. I narrowed my eyes at him. Are you sure about that? Last time I checked, I was my father's only child. When did I get a best friend? Moreover, if I were really close to Giselle, wouldn't she already know who I am? Just then, Giselle turned to my secretary, barking orders. Our family came here to collaborate. If you don't fire this woman today, we're pulling out of the deal. Understood, I said abruptly. She paused, looking smug, but I continued. From this moment on, the Adams family will never collaborate with the Cooper family again. Turning to my secretary, I added, spread the word. All business dealings with the Cooper family are terminated immediately. Yes, President Adams, my secretary replied crisply.